Hi and welcome to another video by Jim the Car Guy. Today we have a 2002, it's a Hyundai Elantra. We're going to be changing the right front axle. I'm going to bring you in there, I'm going to show you what the axle looks like and why we have to change it. But basically it's because the boot is actually split and losing grease, so we're going to replace it. Alright, so to change the axle, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take out this cotter pin right here first. We're going to pull this cotter pin out. We're going to air gun off this nut right here. And then here you can see we took this off already because of we're going to do further work on something else. But this is the axle here that we're going to remove. What we're going to do is we're going to come down on the bottom, right down here by the lower ball joint. This is the lower ball joint right here. We're going to take that nut off, and then we're going to separate the knuckle here from the lower ball joint. We're going to pull this down, and then we'll take the assembly here and pull this out to the side. We are going to disconnect the tie rod end. I'll get a light over here so you can see. We're going to disconnect the tie rod end here. As you can see, the nut is already off. We air gunned the nut off. We took the cotter pin out, and then we're going to separate the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. This way we can pull the whole assembly out of the way and remove the axle from the car. So, alright, so let's get started, and we're going to get going. Alright, we always make sure that the axle is free, because at this point, if the axle is not free, then we will put the nut back on, screw the nut back on by hand, and then we'll hit it through the center right here with like a punch to separate the axle from the bearing assembly. But that's not the case. It's nice and free, so we don't have to worry about that. Alright, next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the tie rod end out. And now that allows everything here to move so you can work a little bit better. We're going to disconnect the ABS sensor so we don't pull it too far and break the sensor. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take the brake line off and remove that off to the side as well, so that way we don't stretch the line. And the next thing we're going to do now is we're going to take out the lower ball joint, the bolt on the lower ball joint. Okay, then once you have the ball joint, the nut off the ball joint, we're going to separate the lower control arm from the knuckle. Now, there's two different ways you can do it. You could bang it with a hammer. Okay, now we're going to pry down on the lower control arm to remove the ball joint from the knuckle itself, and then you can see the axle is now loose. And then we're gonna tie this back out of the way here so we can pull the axle out of the transmission. So let's get a piece of wire and we're going to tie that back. Okay, so now what we did is we actually tied the strut as well as the knuckle back out of the way so we can pop this out of the transmission as straight as possible. Now, taking it out is not a big deal, but putting it back in, you want to try to put it in, you want to try to get it as straight as possible without interfering with anything. So we're going to put a bucket down below, because when we pull the axle out of the transmission, it is going to leak a little bit of fluid. So what we're going to do now is come up underneath the bottom right here. What we're going to do now is we're going to get in here with the pry bar, put the pry bar behind the axle right here and the transmission, and we're going to pry that axle out. All right, Tom. Okay, now the axle is out of the trans, and now we're going to just pull the axle out. You want to match your axle up. The end of the axle, you want to match that up right in here to make sure that it's the same as the one that we're going to put back in. I've seen it before where you'll get an axle and the size here that fits through the seal is different, or the shaft is different. So just match it up to your new axle. So let's grab the new axle and we'll put it back together. Just match up your axle, make sure that the axle ends are the same and that the overall length is the same. Of course, make sure you have your ABS ring on there. And we are going to leave this nut on here. I'm going to show you why once we get this back up into the car, but there's a reason why we're going to leave that on. All right, now you want to take the axle, and as you'll notice, as you notice on the end here, there's a snap ring on there. That snap ring is what holds the axle into the transmission, so it's very important that when you put this in, you see these splines in here? You'll put this in through the transmission. You'll have to rotate the axle until these splines line up in there, but you'll feel it snap in. And you're pushing it as far as you can, and then we're going to get a hammer and just tap on the end of it. Keep the axle as straight as you possibly can, and you'll see it snap, pops right in. Now, you want to make sure that the axle went back into the trans as far as it did, like this, because I've seen it already where another shop did an axle on a Hyundai and they pushed the axle in. It was in almost all the way, but it wasn't in as far as that snap ring holding it in. The customer took the car out for a ride, the axle blew out, and they wound up losing the transmission fluid and wiped out that brand new axle. So you want to make sure that your axle is back into the trans as far as it's supposed to go, like that. Okay, now the reason that we left that nut on there is because when you tap on the end over here, if you don't have this nut on there, you'll wind up peening over the end of this and you'll wind up having a problem trying to get that nut back on. So by leaving the nut on, you tap it on there, and now you know your threads are in good condition and the nut can come right off and of course go right back on. All right, so that's why we left that nut on there. All right, so now let's get that knuckle back over here with the bearing. We'll slide it on here and then we're going to continue. Okay, we'll slide the axle back through the hub bearing. And now we have the axle sticking out the hub bearing. Now we're going to pry down on the lower control arm just so we can get the ball joint back into the knuckle where it's supposed to be. And then once we have that in there, now we can put our nut back onto the lower ball joint, and then we'll tighten up that nut. Okay, and our ball joint is nice and tight now. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to put the nut on the axle here, and we're just going to screw it on temporarily. Okay, and we'll catch the nut by hand. We'll just screw it on, and this has to be air gun back in now. We are going to get the torque specs to tighten this up to the proper foot-pounds, so we're just going to tighten it up temporarily right now, and then we'll come back to that. Okay, now we're going to look it up to get the proper torque specs on this, and we will torque it down to where it's supposed to be. All right, next thing we're going to do now is we're going to come around to the side over here, and we're going to reconnect that tie rod end. Okay, now we're going to reconnect our tie rod end. Basically, you just push it through right through the knuckle right here, and we're going to put the nut on, and we're going to tighten the nut up all the way, and now we're going to come up to the top, and after we put this nut on, we're going to put our cotter pin through, and then we'll reattach the brake line up to the strut as well as the ABS wire. Now these bolts here don't have to be torqued down. You're just going to snug these in so they don't come out. But you don't have to go real tight with these. Just snug them in. The same thing on the front brake line. We're going to reattach that brake line up in here where we previously took it out from. Okay, and that's it. All right, so that's it. We're all set. As always, thanks for watching. See you on the next one.